I so
Just
now
just
that
remember, I didn't turn my air conditioning on at all last year.
I'm already sweating. Anyways, seriously, I mean, I tried to walk around this morning and it was already brutal at 7 o'clock. Anyways, so yeah, I'm not gonna bash Arizona right now. Well, actually, I haven't started streaming, so let me stream. But yeah, right now there's nobody here who can hear me, but in Arizona at least. But yeah, today is Psalms. Today is the first day of Psalms, the first day of a new book of the Bible and a new section of the Bible. I mean, we're going into the third section of the Bible, so this is pretty significant. Thank you everybody for coming out this morning to enter into this third and last section of the Tanakh, right? So we have the Torah, the first section, the 5 books. The next section, Ketuvim, which is the Nevi'im, the prophets that we just finished with Malachi. And then the last part, Ketuvim, which we start today, which is the section of the Bible that literally in Hebrew means writings, but I would call it miscellaneous because it defies classification as a history, as a section of prophetics. There's a little bit of that. There's a lot of what we call wisdom literature in it. There's apocalyptic material in it. There's a little bit of everything. And so it really is kind of a catch-all as opposed to the other books that have a organizing. Well, I should say the prophets are really divided into two things. I'm going to show it to you right now. Let me just make sure that we are indeed on Facebook right now. But the prophets really are two sections: the historical books, and then the prophets that we just read, the prophets that we know of as we're live as as the prophetic people like Isaiah and the guys that they are guys, the guys we've been reading over the last several months. So Joshua through Kings are historical books, and then I'm just going to show you the overview as we are right now, and then tell you something that might shock you, but it is true. And with that, I'm going to show you the editorial decisions that the rabbis made, because the organization of the Bible books was made by the rabbis about 2,000 years ago. The first 5 books, the Torah, is where, of course, we derive our laws, but it starts from creation and goes to the moment just before we enter the land of Israel, right, till Moses' death. So we call it the 5 books of Moses to some extent because the last 4 books, or most of the last 4 books, are all about Moses' leadership. So from chapter 2 to the end of Deuteronomy, Moses is there. That's why we kind of call them the 5 books of Moses. The prophets, as I said, the first part of it, all the way through Kings, this first part is the historical books, taking us from crossing the land into the destruction of the temple. Then we get into the prophets, the literary prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, the big 3, the long 3, and then the 12, what we call minor prophets that we just finished. Those are equal. You add up the 12 from Hosea down to Malachi, they're the same length as a Jeremiah or Isaiah. That's how long those books are compared to the 12 that we just finished. Then we get into the writings, the Ketuvim, Psalms, Proverbs, and then Job, which are all wisdom literature. Then we get into what we call the Megillot, the scrolls. Now, you all know the scroll of Esther, but these are all scrolls. These are all books that are for the most part very short. Ecclesiastes is longer, but these books are all like 4 or 5 chapters. Song of Songs is 8. Ruth is 4. I mean, Lamentations is 5. Esther's a little bit longer. Ecclesiastes. But these are all scrolls that we read at holidays, and that's the way they're organized. We start with Song of Songs that we read at Passover, and then we go to Shavuot, which we're going to be celebrating next week, where we traditionally read Ruth. Lamentations at Tisha B'Av during the summer. Ecclesiastes during Sukkot, which we're going to be at right after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right? Few days after we have Sukkot. And then we go all the way to Esther, the next biblical holiday, which is at the at the end of the cycle. This kind of reflects the cycle that we used to have during the biblical period, where the year began in springtime. And so this starts with the springtime of Passover and ends with the holiday about a month before, which is Purim. Then we get into these last sections of books. Daniel, which is apocalyptic, it is supposed to take place during the Babylonian kingdom times of Nebuchadnezzar and into the Persians. And then Ezra and Nehemiah take place during that. But Daniel's kind of different when we get to it. Well, it's very different, but we'll also see why it's kind of where it is. And then the last two books, the books of Chronicles, are actually a retelling of the events from the Torah, really to kind of, to some extent, Chronicles is another telling of the two books of Kings that we read up here, 1 and 2 Kings. It's another historical account, and it's very similar to Kings, but a little different. And that's the way the Hebrew Bible ends. So again, the Christian organization of the Bible is much different. It's really kind of organized around a historical chronology, but it also is organized so that it finishes, as I showed you with Malachi, with the prophet I showed you last week. It finishes with Malachi, which sets up to some extent Jesus, and the prophetic work of all those prophets, kind of Isaiah, all of them, sets up then Jesus. So that's why the Christian Bible is organized in a different way. So our 3 sections, and here's the part that I'm going to tell you that you're really going to be shocked by if you haven't known this, and you're really maybe even somewhat horrified by this organization of the Tanakh, which we've had for, as I said, 2,000 years. It's not every book of the Bible. Well, yeah, there's actually 2 shocking things I'm going to tell you. These were not all the books that were written by Jewish people during this period. There were books that were not included, that were lost. In some cases, the church kept them, the books that we call the Apocrypha, that were written by Jews and were just not deemed worthy or important enough to be in the Bible. That's one important understanding, that there were just books that didn't make the cut. And the Talmud actually discusses the canonization process to some extent. It's not an extensive discussion like we'd like to know, but there is a little bit about how the rabbis decided which books to be in.
Were any of the Apocrypha not included because they were considered heading in the wrong direction?
Maybe. Well, yes, there's probably definitely some indications of that, like with the Book of Jubilees, which some people said this is just too weird. But though I would argue it's not that much weirder than Daniel, but maybe just a little bit weirder. But we knew this, or we've always known this, but then the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed it, because we found the Book of Jubilees, parts of Jubilees, and the Dead Sea Scroll community, which means there were Jews who were reading this, and not just the rabbis who read it and said it's not going to be included. There were other books that the rabbis said we're not going to put in. So the cutoff to some extent is, as Judith just said, books that were not quite on the right page, or starting to veer off from our understanding of religion, of God, of the way our community is supposed to be organized, all those things. But there's another issue which seems to be also critical here, which is that the books that were newer, like the Book of Jubilees, and to some extent Daniel, but Daniel made the cut, they were newer. And I think there was a sense of, well, it's not quite as holy, right? If it's older, then there's some kind of antiquity value to it, where people said, no, we've been reading this book for hundreds and hundreds of years. Let's put this in. So you almost have to say that if it made the cut and it was a newer book like Daniel, we must say it must have been really important and really popular for it to overcome that, hey, but it's a new book. And we see the same thing to some extent. I always like to tell people, it's like when people talk about what makes classic rock, how long does it have to pass before it's classic rock? And, some people would say, well, that song, it has to be around for 20, 25, 30 years before someone would say that's a classic rock song. And now it's almost like, well, if it's after 1985, it's not going to be a classic rock song. But there's a canonization for that. There's a canonization for film too. We say like, that's a classic, but how long does that have to be a classic for? I mean, no one's ever going to take Citizen Kane out of the top movies. Casablanca. No one's going to take those movies out. But then the question of like what comes in, how long does it take for somebody to say, well, that's truly a classic. That's a movie that deserves to be now, part of the canon, of the canon of our, our cultural canon. And so you almost have to be just such a brilliant movie for people to say, yeah, that's going to be a classic. We're going to say that's a classic. But so some of it's time, and then some of it's also just brilliance where people say, no, we got to include that. So obviously people thought Daniel was brilliant and had to go in. And there's some other books too, that when we get to them, we'll kind of point out, like, this is a late book. I mean, we know from the literature that this was a late book, and people still Judith wants to know whether Princess Bride is part of the classic. It is a classic film. I don't know yet if, there's a certain, I think there's always a certain hump that comedies have to get over in order to be taken seriously. But yeah, it has a lot of elements. It's got great music. It's got great classic lines. I mean, there's things that, like, when people look at what makes a classic movie, I mean, some of it is it made its way into our culture, right? Do people walk around quoting the movie? And, I mean, think about the movies like that, think about the words like Rosebud or Play It Again, Sam. I mean, there's words that come out of the movie that, like, you go, oh, well, that's a classic. So, I think there's definitely some lines from Princess Bride that have inconceivable as well. But there are ones that yeah, they're you always have to wonder whether it's your decision or whether it's society's decision. But let's take a look at where we are today. So the first parts of the Bible of the biblical section of writings. Oh, I didn't tell you the other most egregious and shocking thing that you're not gonna believe, but I'm gonna tell you it's 100% true. The organization of these books into three sections. The organization of these books into three sections, and roughly which books made it and which books didn't make it. For anyone who's ever written or edited or been on either side of that process, there was an editorial decision that was made based on length. And literally, these three sections of the Bible, the Torah, the prophets, and Ketuvim, they fit on a roughly the same size scroll. And so there literally was a decision that was made to some extent that these books are going to be there and not another book, or again, maybe that book can't make it because it literally would have put over the length of that scroll. I know that's insane.
That's not insane. That's like LPs.
I know, but 2,000 years later, we're sitting there going, what didn't you keep because you didn't want to make it too long? It's very frustrating for people who love history and who love Jewish theology and love, like, what didn't make the cut. And yeah, I have to tell you, people made this decision 2,000 years ago, the same way we make the decisions today of what we're going to keep because we don't have enough space on our hard drive.
You wouldn't believe how much stuff I just gave away because it won't fit in my new house.
I know, Rosemary, I wasn't going to say that, but there is a for a
yes, you would believe because you helped me.
For someone who has at least the predilection for hoarding like I do, getting rid of things because you don't have enough space is tough. Because and I've done it. I mean, I've purged things off of my hard drive because I just said I really don't need that anymore. But generally speaking, I'll just buy another external drive.
Rosemary, how many bottles of wine to get rid of books? It's so hard.
We were not drinking. But there's a book called Subtract. Look it up.
Well, I can only tell you,
They study scientifically why it's harder to get rid of things than you think it should be.
Yeah. I do think that sometimes though, and I do it all the time, is like I say, I can't throw that away because that's part of my history, right? So if I say, like, I don't know who's going to care about that part of my history. Like, I don't know if my kids don't seem to care. So maybe my unborn grandchild will care. I don't know. But
They may change their mind when they have children.
yeah, and I don't know, but I do know that I look at my library and I don't buy books anymore because I feel like I'm adding to a problem of like what are my kids going to do? And so I've been very hesitant. I'm also reading less because I'm reading much more online, but I threw away over the weekend. I threw away this past weekend, I threw away pages and pages of materials that I've been collecting from rabbinical school, from college, and I literally had these, Xeroxed off packets that I had for my classes because they were good, and I was always like, hey, if I ever teach a class on that, I have this article, and then I'm thinking to myself, yeah, but am I really gonna copy out all these pages from this? And aren't nowadays I will access whatever I want from the internet, like I'm going to do today for everybody, and I'm not going to give them a set of Xerox copies. So
I got rid of purple mimeographed. You remember the ones that smelled good? I had my teacher files, and I got rid of 30-year-old, 35-year-old purple mimeographed papers.
Yeah. Well, 2,000
It's
years ago,
hard.
2,000 years ago, our ancestors did that with books of the Bible, and they referred to them. I mean, they're mentioned in the Bible. We're like, where's that book? Where's Sefer Yashar? Where's the book of the wars of the Lord? Where they referenced them like we were always going to have them, and that's the worst part. The worst part is they thought we were going to keep them, and some dude tossed them, and they were like, no, I don't know, I didn't know that was the last copy of that. And so somebody thought that it was important, which makes me believe it was important. I wanted to know that. So it's really hard. I mean, it's really hard, especially for the books that are mentioned in the Bible itself, that somebody thought we would have and would just take for granted we would have it. And that's like mind blowing to me. I mean, again, if you don't care about history, then you don't, like this doesn't bother you, but it bothers me because there was stuff that people knew was important, and at some point, like people just screwed up. And again, it's part of the problem is that, and it's not like Jews were alone in this, but our libraries were burned, our people were exiled and killed, and they did take Torah scrolls with them, they did take the prophetic scrolls with them, they did take a Bible with them. And so we do have these things, and that's why we had them in the first place. The reason why we wrote them and then condensed them and then put them on 3 scrolls was so that some guy could put 3 scrolls on his back and get out.
Maybe they're in the basement of the Vatican.
Yeah, I don't think so. Some of this stuff, it will not upset the church if it gets out. Some of it's too old to upset the church, but yeah, whatever.
It could be, misfiled in one of those Greek monasteries.
Yeah. It is weird to think how much.
Every so often, something turns up like a manuscript of Beethoven or.
Yeah, but this stuff unfortunately is 2,000 years old. So the only likelihood of that happening is what happened in 1947 when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was just literally almost a miracle of, like, people still, like, it's hard to explain how miraculous that was. That's why, again, I'm not gonna get like, I don't want to say it was God did it or what. I mean, I don't know, but I don't know how you explain how miraculous that find was, especially literally on the eve of the establishment of Israel. I mean, I just don't know how to explain it other than it almost defies any logical explanation for how those were found and how significant the Dead Sea Scrolls were. I mean, it's hard for people to even explain it because you have to have been steeped in biblical studies in order to do that. By the way, I came across my old papers that I wrote for Richard Friedman, the guy who wrote the Bible. and who I consider a mentor of biblical study. And I read my papers for him, and I didn't realize how um, how how critical he was. I mean, in a good way. But I read through this, I'm like, oh, he completely trashed that. I mean, like I mean, I know he expected a lot from me, but I read it. I was like, gosh, I should have been humbled, very humbled by this critique of my writing. But I mean, it wasn't like that I wrote poorly. It's that I made claims that he said you have no basis for making these claims. And I mean, it's not that I shouldn't say that. He said he would say something like, you haven't proved that. So you know, in some cases I would, you know, say things that he knew was right, but I couldn't, you know, you have to actually write it. So yeah, I was like, man, that was I mean, he still liked me and everything, but yeah, I didn't realize how when I went back and read it, I'm like, gosh, if I had read that through the eyes of today, I would have said, you're a failure. But anyways, it was still, I mean, it's still humbling and in a way kind of I'm appreciate his taking the time to consider the stuff that I wrote. I mean, they were assignments. I don't want to say like I just wrote it for fun, but I did take it seriously. Unfortunately, I realized that everything that I was doing at that point was something that pretty much no one would ever care about. So that's why I don't do it anymore. But for as a 20-year-old to be writing papers on subjects that really nobody cares about is not the worst thing you can do. So looking back on it, you know, if my kids had done that, or somebody else's kids were writing papers on subjects for biblical study that no one ever cared about, it's not the worst thing in the world, right? That's not the only thing that I was doing in college, by the way. I want to make it clear that there was also, I did go to parties, but you know, whatever. That's why I'm not teaching in a college right now. So, well, honestly, I mean, nobody cared about, no one would have cared about the stuff I would have written about. Like whether the Ammonites, whether we can learn something about who wrote the Bible by, you know, what they say about the Ammonites. Nobody cared about that. I did. I mean, I thought he did. I mean, biblical scholars did. Nobody else cares about that. So that being said, let's take a look at what really is one of the most important. I don't want to say important in the sense that like what part of the Bible isn't important, but one of the most studied and lived and sung parts of the Bible. Oh, I just want to show you one thing that was kind of interesting here was the description of Psalms here in our Sepharia.
Rabbi,
oh, yeah.
Can we dedicate today for?
Oh yeah, sorry. So today is we're remembering the yahrzeit of Mike's father, Kenneth Schwartz. So we're dedicating a study to him today, and maybe he'd be remembered for goodness. And again, he loved
and he loved Psalms.
And
this is the perfect day because he loved Psalms.
That's perfect. Excellent. And as we read Psalms, I hope everyone starts to kind of feel a connection to a psalm or two. And we'll definitely think about him today. The description of Psalms here is, it says poems of despair, hope, gratitude, and supplication to God attributed to David and others. That is true, other than the fact that they're not poems, they're songs. So we see them as poems a lot, but they're poems in the same way that some songs lyrically are poetic. And
the Nobel Prize Committee said that songs are poems.
Yes.
You're going to argue with them?
I'm going to argue with the fact that most people who write lyrics today are not poets. There are exceptions, and they usually get recognized by somebody like the Nobel, like Bob Dylan, who got recognized with the Nobel Prize. But for the most part, again, it's important to know that these were always accompanied by music. And so we're not going to sing all of them. There's not great, I mean, there's lots of, every psalm has been set to music. Some of them are more, and we're going to hear lots. I promise you're going to hear every type of genre in in this as we go through it. And every week we're going to hear at least one psalm. Probably less today because the psalms from the first part are actually not as well known. The first like 20 or so psalms aren't as well known as certain sections. There's certain sections that really stand out. I'm going to show you the organization in a second, but the idea that psalms are poems kind of comes to us from the fact that oftentimes we read them, and there's people that read them all the time. There's people, I've mentioned that sometimes I'll be on the subway in New York and I'll see somebody, that's what they're doing. They're reading Psalms. They're reading the Psalm of the day. We have a Psalm every day that we read, a traditional Psalm. There's a Psalm for Tuesday. Actually, we'll get to that Psalm. It's one of the more unusual Psalms. And then there's Psalms that people read at certain times. And we did do this 17 years ago, and some of you were actually with us 17 years ago when we were reading Psalms the last time.
Not been 17 years, you lie.
2007. I hate to say it, but it's 2007. So I shared this back then. This is the psalmomancy, and I can send this around to people, don't worry. But these are the lists. This is a list of psalms that traditionally for us, this is the psalm number and what it's used for. People would say psalms for doing certain things. Why? Because it's mentioned in the psalm. So if the psalm made a reference to certain things, like Psalm 90, which mentions fever, that was a good psalm to be said when you're trying to protect yourself from a fever. So these are the psalms that are look at this, unseen as snake or scorpion. So primarily for protection, primarily for asking God for help in a certain situation. But again, to some extent, and again, whenever you see against something, it's for that thing not to happen. They're not said to cause other people to have bad things happen, but they are to some extent seen as some kind of magical force, which is why it's called psalmomancy. Like all different kinds of magic and incantations, like necromancy and what other mancies can we think of? Anyways, these are magic. This is soul magic, and so people would read the Psalms for protection primarily, but also in some cases to. Here's one against crying children on the airplane. Next time you're on the airplane.
Wish I had known that 22 years ago. That's for sure. That one.
So that's psalmomancy. I also want to show you a little bit before we dive into the Psalms today, a little bit about what's going on in the Psalms themselves. So the Wikipedia page on this is pretty interesting because it brings together lots of things here. But one of the important things I do want to let people know ahead of time is there was an editorial. There are editorial decisions at play with the Psalms. So when people say, well, why are the Psalms like this? Why is it collected and edited this way? Well, because there was an editorial decision. They're not chronological. They're not all one section from King David. There are parts that are from King David and parts that aren't. When we hear one from King David, as we most famously do it in Psalm 23, that is the most famous psalm, but it's one of the most famous parts of the Bible. It begins Mizmor LeDavid, a psalm of David. There are 116 superscriptions to psalms, which means that a direction or there's a word at the beginning, like Mizmor LeDavid, at the beginning of 116 out of 150. That's quite a lot. But very importantly, you can see that there really are like a book. There are books within the book. There are 5 sections with approximately, not quite, but as you can see, there's about 30 psalms per section. Though books 3 and 4 are shorter, and the other books, well, book 2 is exactly 30, but the other ones, book 1 and book 2 are longer. So it's not exactly 30, but roughly, 30 Psalms per book. But again, this is some people say, imitates the division of the Torah. I do want to tell you a little bit about what Psalms mean in other religions. It's important. Obviously, Christianity, very important. The 150 Psalms are very important to them. Though, for some Christians, there's actually 151 Psalms. Oh my gosh, a bonus Psalm. If you're Eastern Orthodox, you get a 151st Psalm. There are even versions used in the Syriac church in the Middle East. Aramaic speaking Christians, by the way, the Christians who actually speak Aramaic on a daily basis, Syriac churches, that have actually even more Psalms, right? And then we also have what are called the Psalms of Solomon, which are written by us, but they only still exist in a Greek and Syriac translation, right? And that leads us to this conclusion that these and other indications suggest that the current Western Christian and Jewish collection of 150 Psalms were selected from a wider set. Editorial decision. These 150 make it. These rest of these don't make it.
How would you say Psalms are defined compared to a poem, a prayer, a song? Topic?
That's tough because well, if you mean how are they different 2,000, 2,500 years ago? Look, first of all, the Psalms themselves, I haven't gotten to this part yet, but I will mention it now. The Psalms themselves were written over a period of probably about 500 years, which is a long time, a really long time. Even in the ancient world where things didn't change as fast as they do today. I mean, 500 years today would mean that some of them were written in, King James English and some of them are written in hip hop, right? So that would be 500 years of English, if you will. Similar things would happen over 500 years in Hebrew, right? But what also is important to understand is that there's also different cultural influences over those 500 years and different theological considerations too. I mean, people's philosophies and ideas about God changed over that 500 years as well. And 500 years is just a long time for people to be Jewish. Think about how Judaism's changed over the last 500 years. So it's interesting that that's at play. So then to ask the question, Judith, that you just asked, what defines them? A lot of it had to do with what defined them in over that period of time. What defined something 500 years before, the later Psalms were made into it? It's a really interesting question because, again, could you imagine? I'm just, again, to use the analogy, and again, it's not really far-fetched, and because we're going to listen to those. The amazing thing about Psalms is that people have been writing compositions to them for thousands of years, and we have recorded music, notated music, I would say, in some cases too, right? That we can listen to Gregorian chants that go back 1,200 years, and then we can listen to modern compositions of Psalms that were written yesterday, and people would say, "Oh, well, how is that music similar to that music, other than that there's music, there's a sound behind it?" But it's amazing to think how much happened to Psalms before they even made their way into the final version. That's the thing that's so kind of mind-blowing about it, is that over time that people said, well, that works and that works. And the problem, of course, is, Judith, we don't know the music behind it, right? So we don't know how different the Psalms that were written, really early versus the Psalms that were written later, how different the music was behind those Psalms. Look, there are people who love Gregorian chants that are 1,000 years. I mean, I like Gregorian chants. They're 1,000 years old, and you're like, oh, that's really powerful music. I like it. I like listening to it. And it's not part of my daily workout jam, but I listen to it, and And you think about it, you're like, oh, I'm listening to music that's 1,000 years old. So it's interesting that, like, even though I don't understand the modality or the, like, I don't live in a society where that's the only music that I hear, it still resonates. And that's the interesting thing about the Psalms, is that they resonate to us as literature, as a poem, but think about how they resonate to us if we could hear them over the last 3,000 years. I mean, that would really be amazing to hear the way they were sung. We're going to get to that. And I will say, we're not 100% sure, but there might be a connection to the Gregorian chant and to the way that these were chanted in the temple 2,500 years ago. We don't know for sure, but there is a possibility that some of the sounds are at least similar to that. This is kind of as an overview. And again, if you want to read the page, there's a lot of interesting stuff on there. And here, of course, it talks about the fact that there were also influences on the Psalms, and the fact that we found a text that were Canaanite texts from Ugarit, which is in modern day Lebanon. These texts are very similar to some of our Psalms. And so there are influences now that we found that some people would say, like, maybe that this wasn't even like a Jewish psalm to begin with, that it might have been a Canaanite psalm that we edited and we reworked it to make it Jewish, which is a really interesting idea, which again we can now know because of the archaeology. We didn't know, nobody told us. The rabbis definitely didn't tell us that this psalm was based on a Canaanite text. They never would have told us that. You know, again, what does it mean? We don't know for sure, but if a Jewish, if a temple Levite, a temple priest 2,700 years ago heard a really good Canaanite liturgical piece to their god El and said, you know, I don't have to do a lot to turn this into a piece of music for God, for Adonai, why not? You know, and we're constantly doing that with Jewish music as well to this day. So you know, here's a little bit of what I've already told you, which is the Psalms were redacted into a single collection during the Second Temple period. And I will tell you that, again, while we don't know what the music sounded like, there definitely were musical directions in the Psalms based on the superscriptions, where it will say, for example, the eighth, or on the Gittit, for example. So we don't know for sure what the tones look like. Don't know. We would also say that, again, maybe some of those cantillations or sounds, right, the fancy way of saying the way that it was sung, made its way into the church, but we don't know for sure. There also is a chance that we've been, certain communities, especially like, you know, communities in the Middle East, may have been keeping those songs alive. There are cantillation marks on them, and I will just show you. There is cantillation. There are marks on these, but we don't know exactly how they were sung. And people argue over which is closer to the original sound. Is it Ashkenazi pronunciation? Is it Yemenite pronunciation? Is it Sephardic pronunciation, or the way that it's sung? There's discussions about it, and it's not always, well, the stuff in the Middle East has to be right. It could be that, you know, they were influenced by Arabic sounds, and, you know, we just don't know. You know, we're not 100% sure. So I will say, I wanted to show one other thing. Let me just show you. Well, of course, we said Psalms are used in Jewish rituals all over the place. Psalm 145, the psalm we call Ashrei, we do all the time. And according to what we read in our Talmud class the other night, we're supposed to say it 3 times a day. And that's one of the ways we get into heaven, is by doing it 3 times a day. It says right here. It's read 3 times a day. That's Psalm 145, the Ashrei. We oftentimes refer to the Psalms by the first word, the incipit. That's the way that it's we oftentimes refer to them. Of course, in Christian worship, very important. Psalms, we're going to listen to some of the Psalms that are been put to Christian use. I will say that some of the Psalms that are important for Christians, may have been because they were important to us as Jews and then became important. But of course, some are used, as we're going to see, Psalm 22, just before Psalm 23, very important for Christianity, but also has a very interesting kind of, to some extent, I would say, again, it's really the psalm that explains the passion of Jesus during his last moments. I also want to point out that here you can see all the different church stuff. According to tradition, in Islam, they believe that the Psalms were also holy books, and they believe that they were given to David by God, and they're considered to be holy books. How's that different than the Bible? Well, to some extent, Islam feels that the Bible that we have is corrupted, with the exception of the Torah and Psalms, and for Christians, the books of the 4 Gospels. So the Muslims consider to be a divine work in Islam. You can see here that, even in the modern religious world for the Rastafarian movement, Psalms were very important. So we're going to dive into some of the Psalms today after that kind of introduction. This mentions some of the Psalms. Some of these we're going to hear, right? These were Psalm collections that were put into these are just some of the Psalms that were put into collected Psalms that were put into musical pieces by famous composers. This one happened to be German Jewish, one of the most important Jewish composers of music, Lewandowski. But of course, this is a more modern composer of music that a lot of people just saw a movie about, the Chichester Psalms. We're going to listen to them. You can see that these have inspired people throughout the generations. We're also going to, by the way, hear part of Mendelssohn's Psalms. Mendelssohn was an amazing composer. A lot of people know Mendelssohn, or they know his music. He was born Jewish. He was converted by his father when he was 7. His father's father was a man named Moses Mendelssohn, who was one of the greatest Jewish philosophers of all time, lived in the 1700s, and is by many people considered the father of Reform Judaism. He advocated for Judaism to become part of Western culture, wanted Jews to assimilate, but yet be very engaged in their Jewish connections. His son kind of felt not very good about that in a way. He converted as well, but actually had his kids convert. But Abraham Mendelssohn famously said he used to be known as the son of a very famous father, and he said that now I'm known as the father of a very famous son. So he seemed to have had a little bit of a complex, Abraham Mendelssohn, in that his father was very famous and his son was very famous, and he wasn't. And by the way, his son Felix seemed to, and especially Felix's sister Fanny, interesting people if you want to read about Fanny and Felix Mendelssohn. And by the way, Fanny may have written some of Felix Mendelssohn's music that would only be taken seriously if a guy wrote it. Fanny and Felix both felt very uncomfortable with the fact that their dad, made them Christian. And I don't say that he didn't renounce his Christianity, Felix or Fanny, but Fanny has a Jewish star on her tomb, and quite frankly, they seem to understand that their dad had a complex that was kind of had to do with his own inadequacies or his own feelings of inadequacy. So everybody knows a little bit of Felix Mendelssohn. Trust me, you know it. But we'll get to that when we get to one of the Psalms that he wrote a beautiful version for. If anybody has favorite Psalms that are set to music and they're not, I definitely speak up and jump in with a Psalm. If we get to a Psalm, when we get to that Psalm and say, I really like this music, we definitely will play it. I have no agenda as far as the music that I put in. It's kind of the stuff that I aesthetically like, but also I want to give people a sense of the amazing spectrum of psalm music that it literally covers every genre. So I'm also like making an attempt not to just do one genre or again focus on one thing. In the last years since we did this class, fortunately, there's so many new psalms that have come out that I can share that we didn't have 17 years ago. So people continue to write beautiful versions of these psalms. They definitely focus on certain psalms and not others. I mean, there's just people. Sometimes you think that people are like looking through psalm or they're reading a psalm and they're like, I want to write a musical version of it. But it seems like a lot of times people will say, you know what? I want to do a musical version of this psalm because everyone else has done a musical version of the psalm. So part of it is based on, I want to do that. So I'll give you one example. Well, this example, but I'm going to just tell you that, this is a psalm. Psalm 133 begins with the words, Hine ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad, right? How good it is for us to be together. Now, how many versions of Hine ma tov do you know? They come out with new ones every year. So, people love that, though. They love that song. They love the words. They love the melody of somebody else. And they say, I want to make a melody of that. And I think I can add to this by having a melody of Hine ma tov. But, it seems like to a certain extent, people are writing, unfortunately, to some extent, they write the same psalm over and over and over again. But this is the first psalm, and we're going to read this one now after that very long introduction. But you can talk about psalms just in a general way for days and days, because they are really, to some extent, one of the most important sections of the Bible. Not just because they do have a little bit of stuff that tell us about, our ancestors, but really they're timeless and they are as powerful today as they were 3,000 years ago. And how many things are there in our lives that we read and then we go, oh my gosh, that's not that could have been written just now. And at the same time, knowing that for thousands of years, people have been inspired by this. And when they've said these words, it was meaningful for them, and it's still meaningful for us. And that connection, I guess we could call tradition, is one of the most powerful things that we engage in throughout time, which is saying the same words as our ancestors did, because they mean something to us too in our lives, not just because we're saying because they said it, but because it means something to us too. So let's take a look at this one, which again, Psalm 1, we will hear a musical version of this, but let's take a look at Psalm 1. Rosemary, if you'd be so kind.
Happy is the man who has not followed the counsel of the wicked, or taken the path of sinners, or joined the company of the insolent. Rather, the teaching of the Lord is his delight, and he studies that teaching day and night. He is like a tree planted beside streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, whose foliage never fades, and whatever it produces thrives. Not so the wicked. Rather, they are like chaff that wind blows away. Therefore, the wicked will not survive judgment, nor will sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord cherishes the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked is doomed.
So very short, right? 6 verses. And this is, as we saw, some people say this psalm when they want to think about fruit coming to bear, because it talks about fruit. But of course, that's not really what it's about. And what's really interesting about this is again, as Jews, we didn't really know them by numbers, because again, all of our chapters and verses were put in by Christian scholars for the sake of organization. For us, we knew them by their names, and again, many people knew the whole song. And you're wondering, like, did someone really know all these songs by heart? Yes, they did, because they, just like the word, as I say all the time, all the word. Well, some of you know the words to American Pie, or at least the first 10 verses of it. That's what this is. It's a song, and you remember it. If you remembered it as a song and sang it as a song, you'd remember it in a different way. This psalm is right at the beginning, comes right out, and again, to some extent, has many of the characteristics that we'll see in other psalms. It has that this what we've seen already in the books of the prophets, and again, a little bit in the Torah, is it's a poetic structure. It's biblical poetry, which repeats the same idea. And it also, as we see a lot of times, will say the good thing and then the bad thing. And we have that in a lot of the Psalms. Good thing and then the bad thing. And so this psalm, not wild about this translation. It's not my favorite translation from it, only because there's a couple things here. And again, it's a very literal translation. But what's really interesting about this, first of all, happy is a good translation for Ashrei. Sometimes people use the word blessed. I don't know does anyone, I don't know, guys, do you have the King James there by your side? Anybody?
Yeah, it says blessed.
Yeah. It's
So
not
does the NIV, blessed.
Yeah. Blessed is not the best translation for Ashrei. Only because, again, we do have a word for blessed. It's Baruch. And there is that sense of blessing. But some people have pointed out before that Ashrei, the word Ashrei means happy, or again, somebody who's successful. It's Osher. It's why, by the word, the name Asher in Hebrew, the Hebrew name Asher is considered such a great, it's been such a long-lasting name, is because it means happy. It means somebody who's fortunate, successful. They're Osher. They're happy. A lot of this is kind of like, because the person is happy, it's almost like it's almost like a step. I won't say it's a step beyond blessed, but it's almost like that person's now feeling that, which is, or at least people think that they're feeling that, which is a really great idea, that they actually have like kind of felt this blessing. So that's, and again, it's the first word of Ashrei, Psalm 145, Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha, the way we sing Ashrei. It actually is the part of Psalm 144. The Ashrei is actually a combination of a couple psalms, but what the word Ashrei, people know, means happy, or it can be blessed, but it's the good thing. You want to be happy. Oftentimes, by the way, this psalm is, I'd say often, you'll see it in books for funerals in Judaism. You'll see it in the chapel book. You'll see it in the chapel memorial book in a lot of synagogue, in a lot of cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, because over the years it's been used as a psalm to recognize when someone's died, that we hope that they've been Ashrei, right? Ashrei ha'ish, happy is the man. I think it's not my favorite psalm to do at a funeral, only because it's kind of presumes certain things that, like, I don't know. I mean, it's a beautiful psalm, don't get me wrong. I don't know that it's the best for a funeral, but there are people who've done it, and they've done it for years. So I don't want to besmirch anyone who's done it at a funeral or heard it at a funeral. It's just not my cup of tea for a funeral, because I don't think it really, I think it's a little bit more of a psalm for, hey, let's have good behavior. Because if we have good behavior, we're going to be happy and it's going to be good for us. And one of the reasons I don't love the Hebrew on this, the translation, is because the Hebrew is actually more powerful than the English translation gives it credit for, even though it kind of translated literally. How does the King James translate verse 1? Or the NIV, sorry. How does the NIV do it?
Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers.
Did anyone notice glory? Well, glories, the translation is closer to the King James. Did anyone notice the verbs that were used in glories as opposed to the ones that are here? Read the 3 verbs that you had there. Just pull them out. Maybe people will see them.
Does not walk, or stand, or sit.
Yeah. Now, that wasn't a grammar. I wasn't a grammar test, but you passed it, Glory, perfectly.
I was hoping.
If you understand the way that they translated this didn't capture that. It's true that all of this is kind of like, didn't change the intent of it. It follows the spirit of it. But follow instead of walk, taken instead of stood, and joined instead of sat. Look at what it does in Hebrew and what a better translation conveys in that, which is walking, standing, and then sitting. Think about that motion right there. This is
the
why.
Hafta.
What?
It's the Hafta.
A little bit, yeah. Though that's
walk by the way when you
that has lying down. But look at what happens, right? Because if somebody walks in the counsel of the wicked, or stood with the sinners, or sat down with the insolent, or however you're going to translate litzah, insolent's fine. It's saying, look, there's 3 bad ways to be. Wicked, so you have those 2, the reshaim, right? Those are the wicked. Chataim are the sinners. We use the word chet all the time in high holidays, right? But it means more of missing the mark, or not doing not aiming right. And then the last one, of course, is the leitzim, the insolent. But notice that again, all of these actions, some people have interpreted it to mean like, you'll walk with them, then you'll stand with them, and then you'll sit down with them. So, that there's a powerful kind of like, but however you want to understand it, there is a motion, there are motions, and there are activities that go with these 3 things. And again, whether you want to line them up, that this makes sense if you look at what wickedness is, or what sin is, or what insolence is, that's what you would do with those things. Like, that's the right verb that matches up with those. But it's a really powerful image just when considering that these are movements, that these are not just poetic expressions, but these are actually, there's something in this that has to do with walking, standing, sitting. And it is there. It's not like, that's not an interpretation, that's there. And that's why, as much as this music, whatever music accompanied it, there is a beautiful lyrical and again, an intention in the wording of this, which is very powerful. This is one little example. That's just not, you could do this, and people have throughout the Psalms. But I do want to show you that, again, the translation kind of obscures that a little bit. Again, very famous kind of idea too that we talk about, that we meditate. How do we not do that? We study, right? We study Torah, right? In your Torah, right? I delight, right? And then I study, I meditate. Sometimes the translation here will be, instead of studies, probably says there recites or utters, but it's almost like I say the words, right? I'm saying the words as I'm walking down the street, I start saying "Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha," love your neighbors yourself. I'm reciting these things because it's helping me remember what to do, right? Kavod aim, ava aim, honor your father and mother. This is vayira, also fear your mother and your father. But those words that stick out in our minds for as Rosemary said, in the Ve'ahavta, so Ve'ahavta, love God, right? And then also, of course, Ve'ahavta l'recha kamoa, love people. But those words and meditating on those words and reciting them, however you want to translate yegay, I'm going to think about them. They're going to be running in my head. And again, yeah, it's basically saying I'm going to think about those. And again, look, you have songs that run in your head. I'll have a lyric that's stuck in my head. I got to listen to the music because I know I gotta hear that song because it's stuck in my head. That lyric is stuck and I want to hear it. I want to hear that person sing it. Yeah.
I like the notes here. I'm going to read it to you.
Sure.
The Psalter begins by proclaiming the blessedness of the godly and ends by calling all living things to praise God in his earthly and heavenly sanctuaries. Walk in, order his life according to. And then it goes to stand, station oneself. And then it says sit, to settle oneself.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what, we're talking about here, of understanding that, I mean, he uses the movements in the negative at first, like don't do those things. But again, if you think about, the fact that all of those things are ways for us to kind of get it right or to get it wrong, when we're walking, the way that we should, when we're, standing in the right area, in the right path, or a right group of people in the right way. And then again, when we're actually sitting down, what are we sitting down to do? We're sitting down to study. We're sitting down to, consider these words. It helps keep us, it helps keep us focused on the important things and on and trying to live as holy of a life as we can. And again, by holy, I mean, it's not like, I don't know that I'm doing exactly what God wants me to do at every moment, but I know that, like, if I'm thinking about it, if I'm thinking about my life having more purpose, then I know that I'm kind of living the life that I'm supposed to live. Whether I'm doing it for a religious reason or not, everybody knows when they're living a life that is following and kind of like it's in the way that this is going to be a way that's going to help the world. It's going to help my family. It's going to help my friends. It's going to help make the world a better place. Like, we all know that. You don't have to have God tell you that. You know that. But again, the Psalms remind us that it matters, like what you're doing, what you're doing on a daily basis, and where you're walking, where you're standing, where you're sitting. And that all matters. And it's very, very hard for people, as we know, when they're in that bad area, when they're in that group, within that group of people that, I tell people all the time, it's almost impossible for someone to get clean, get sober when they're not in the right environment. It's virtually impossible. If you don't get yourself out of the group of people that you're with, it's virtually impossible. So, it's almost impossible to, and we love stories about that. I just saw one of those, I'd seen it before, but I just saw they were 60 Minutes just replayed the last weekend, the story about Rich Paul, who got off the streets of Cleveland, got out of drug dealing, and is now, now one of the most successful agents in sports. And again, he had to get out of that environment that he was in, otherwise he would have died. And I think about, there's those stories of people who were able to break out of the environment that they were in that was gonna kill them. And that is something that we knew thousands of years ago, and we know it today. And there always are better environments for us to be in, and people that we need to be around, and other people we can't be around. So even if it's fun to be around them, we know that it's destructive. So on the good side, and again, as Glory pointed out, one of the commentaries there was also one of the things that we see throughout the Psalms is the beauty of nature. And it's one of the things that, like, sometimes gets obscured because, like, people, they focus on kind of the meaning, the overall meaning, which is definitely, it's beautiful and it's important and it's thoughtful and it's going to change our lives. But what's also really important in the Psalms is how beautiful and how connected nature is to the world and to us. And so when we read this line here, he's like a tree planted by streams of water who yields their fruit, comparing someone who's living a happy life, that's living a successful life by our measure, right? By the measure of, living a holy life and living a life of goodness. They're compared to a healthy tree, to a tree that's being fed with water, with life-sustaining energy. And this goes throughout the Psalms. Like every Psalm, like that really like stands out in my mind. I mean, Psalm 23 is the most important one, right? God lays me down in green pastures, leads me beside the still waters. I mean, think about how important nature is for our sense of security in the Psalms. And I would say, like, it kind of reminds us that we need to, connect with nature as much as possible. And I talked about that at services a couple of weeks ago, with the way the news is just kind of it's hammering us all the time. It's really important to get outside into nature and to just turn off television for a bit, especially the news, and just to hear nature, just to see nature, just to look up at the sky. And I mentioned that it was so wonderful that we had this whole thing of the Northern Lights going on, where people were going out and looking at the sunset, looking at the night sky, and being able to see that and take themselves out and remember that there's an amazing world around us that is one of the greatest blessings. And our ancestors knew that. And they compared like a healthy person to healthy things in nature. I mean, and they didn't, let's face it, they weren't destroying nature like we are. They weren't perfect, but they didn't do what we did, which was the wholesale destruction of, bodies of water and of, of forests. They cut down trees and they went to war and they burned things down, but not at the level that we do today. And they understood that, that these are gifts. These are like things that we have to treasure, which is why we read about in the Torah that, the considerations we have to have when we take down a tree. So, I mean, how much more, this is image of a tree planted beside the water is an image that we have in a lot. I mean, all over. I mean, just even thinking about, by the waters of Babylon, even when they weren't at home, they realized that, there's a beauty in nature, even in exile, and it wasn't home. I mean, they made that very clear. They're not at home, but they realized that, there's nature, beautiful nature there too. Maybe that's the one thing that they could have seen that was the same, was God's beauty, reflected in nature. So again, the Psalm kind of ends with a reminder in Psalms in verses 4 and 5 that this is, the bad way of living is also reflected in something of nature, which is chaff that gets blown away. So, and then of course it finishes with the kind of the thing at the, from the beginning, the way of the righteous, which is again getting back to kind of walking and being on the path, derech, right? The path of the righteous versus the path of the wicked. So again, not my favorite psalm for reflecting on a whole life or like at a funeral time, because it seems to, I mean, I know why it was there. It was there so that people would say, oh, this person was a righteous person. He was a happy person, Ashrei Ha'ish. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not 100% sure that that's always the right thing to say. So I don't always do that, but I almost always do Psalm 23 because people expect it. And quite frankly, it's not for the person who died, it's for everybody else. And I always tell people, this is a psalm of comfort. It's not a psalm of death. And we'll get to it, not this week, probably a couple of weeks from now, we'll get to Psalm 23 and we'll maybe just talk about Psalm 23 that day. Who knows? But here, let's get to that's Psalm 1. Unless there's any questions or comments, I want to rush through it. But as you can see, some of the Psalms, very, very short, 6, 7, 8 verses, especially here at the beginning, which by the way, might be one of the reasons why these were also not set to music, because they're very short. They're almost like part of a song, but they're not. I'm not implying that there was a longer version of this song, the extended version, which had a whole guitar solo. But I do believe that some of the songs were used at certain times, and like an opening song would sometimes be a shorter song, maybe at the temple, right? So these first ones you'll see that's one of the things that are similar about them, is they're shorter. Okay.
Why do nations assemble and peoples plot vain things? Kings of the earth take their stand, and regents intrigue together against the Lord and against his anointed. Let us break the cords of their yoke, shake off their ropes from us. He who is enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord mocks at them. Then he speaks to them in anger, terrifying them in his rage. But I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. Let me tell of the decree the Lord said to me. You are my son, I have fathered you this day. Ask it of me, and I will make the nations your domain, your estate, the limits of the earth. You can smash them with an iron mace, shatter them like potter's ware. So now, O kings, be prudent, accept discipline, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord in awe, tremble with fright, pay homage in good faith, lest he be angered and your way be doomed in the mere flash of his anger. Happy are all who take refuge in him.
Yep. And there you again have the word ashrei, right? Happy are all who take refuge in him. Now, this song goes in a completely different direction in the sense that it seems to be more about other nations, and it seems to be a kind of psalm, almost a political psalm, which is my king, my Moshiach, right? My anointed is the right one, and everybody else is wrong, and they're all going to be destroyed. Now, it'll be interesting to Glory, if you want to read what your commentary says about verse 2 in your commentary. What does it say about verse 2?
Verse 2. Let's see. Hold on. Lord, his anointed one. To rebel against the Lord's anointed is also to rebel against the one who anointed him. Anointed one. Let's see, it goes on. The psalm refers to the Davidic king, and it's ultimately fulfilled in Christ. The English word Messiah comes from the Hebrew word for anointed one, and the English word Christ comes from the Greek word for anointed one.
Yeah. So I will tell you, that is a much more modern Christian understanding of that. Because while, of course, it did get to the point that this is really fulfilled in Jesus as the Moshiach, that's the word, right? That's the word Messiah. So, our translation is anointed because that's what, and again, that's what the commentary you just read is, which is a description of what Christ means. It means anointed. It means the anointed one. It's a translation of the word Moshiach. Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is that translation reflects a more modern understanding of this, which is that this clearly can't be about Jesus. Now, that's why they say it's fulfilled in Christ, that it's fulfilled in Jesus eventually. But the reason why this can't be about Jesus is because this is about the king at that moment. It's not about the king who's going to come, because this is about the one that is actually there now. And what it's saying is that king, the one who I've installed on Zion, which is Jerusalem, right? The one that I've installed in Jerusalem is going to be the one that everyone eventually will pay attention to. Now, he doesn't seem to be talking about thousands of years from now. He seems to be talking about right now at this moment, this king will be the one that all other kings will be fearful of. And it seems to not really be about Jesus as the Messiah. It seems to be about a king who rules as a king. What does he do? He smashes people with an iron mace. I mean, this is not, though there is Christ as a warrior king that is depicted in some Christian writings, right? It's not the general feeling that people want to have of Jesus. So it's very clear that the language here is referring to a human king and not one that is gonna eventually rule at a certain point. But what's interesting here, of course, is this phrase right here. That the Messiah is also called God's son, which means that some people, or at least again, in the ancient world, in our world, in the ancient world, in the Jewish world, the Messiah, the king, the human king would be called God's son. So it didn't necessarily have to be interpreted as literally the Son of God. So again, the Christian commentary on it is going to say, hey, look, this refers to Jesus eventually. But they're also recognizing that this is clearly something that somebody said about a Jewish king that lived, thousands of years ago. Again, how far along was it? 2,600 years ago, 2,800 years ago. I mean, biblical scholars will look at certain parts of the Psalm and say, well, that was written based on this word or the construction of these words together, that it must have been 2,800 years ago. But the point is that, I mean, I'm not sure about that. Let me put it this way: people will argue over it no matter what. So I'm not going to tell you, hey, it's 2,800 years ago and not 2,600 years ago. But I won't do that unless I have very good evidence. Otherwise, my professor will get mad at me in the back of my mind. But I will tell you that it's not whenever this was written, it was written thousands of years ago, and it clearly refers to a king who, again, is a human king. So,
Hey, Rabbi.
yeah.
So with all the analysis that's been done over all the religious artifacts and the Bible and all the books, they had to have identified close to it the dates that these were authored. And so who would have been the king at the time?
Well, it would have been one of the Davidic kings, right? It would have been one of the descendants of King David. So how far along is it? We don't know, because I mean there's arguments that it's, again, based on the language of when it would be, but you really can't be, look, there's certain things that will give it away, like that can show you that anyone would know. For example, the fact that they use the word iron mace means, first of all, it's clearly from, a time when iron was used in a mace, right? So the word barzel kind of gives it away. See if anything else. Just little things. The fact that the word Zion is used, Zion, tells us that this is, again, from not the beginning of David's kingship, but a couple hundred years later. These are just things I'm showing you that like these are kind of giveaways, that like the code is there, like whatever, the clue is there, but ones that I can show you that are really, really, really obvious. But we don't know necessarily within 200 years, right? Sometimes when somebody says something about the destruction of the temple, then we know that that's post-exilic, that was written after the temple was destroyed. So, very famously, Psalm 137, which talks about the destruction of Zion, we know that was written after 586. Like, there's certain things that are just obvious. But the fact, again, that some things were written hundreds of years before the destruction of the temple, and then some were written after, that's how we know that the Psalms were written over hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's why, again, even though time was moving slower back then, and I mean, in the sense that like things didn't change as fast, it's still an amazing amount of time. And we have to understand that, again, that they reflect slightly different like realities for people. And to some extent, again, people who've lived through certain things like the destruction of the temple are going to have a different take on things than someone who's writing 300 years before that happened. So Yeah, it's like people who lived before and after the Holocaust. I mean, people who died before the Holocaust happened might say certain things that somebody who was born after the Holocaust would never say, or the existence of Israel. Like there's things that will give it away that somebody who's like has written post 1948 and pre 1948. So again, I'm only pointing this out because what's interesting about Glory's commentary is that it is actually a very modern consideration to say this is Davidic. When it says it's Davidic, that means it referred to not David necessarily, but the Davidic line, that one of his descendants, that this is talking about one of those descendants. Is it David in particular? Probably not, but and it doesn't say it's a Psalm of David, I mean, anyways, but that's not the point. The point is that I'm only telling you that commentary reflects a more modern interpretation, taking into consideration like the evidence, which is, well, when we look at this, it's clearly not about Jesus per se, even though again they'll say, but it came in fruition, or it's going to come into fruition in an ultimate way by Jesus. It's clearly not, based on what the psalm says. So again, not one of the more famous psalms, but kind of gives you a little bit of the sometimes political statements of the Psalms. And it's not, I've never analyzed it. I don't know if anyone's analyzed, it might have even said on that Wikipedia page, so maybe it's right there, how many Psalms actually have like a political agenda to some extent. But that one kind of has a political agenda, which is that the Davidic king is in power and he's going to conquer everybody else. So that's kind of a political psalm if you think about it. All right, so this one has a Mizmor LeDavid, and not only does it have a Mizmor LeDavid, it has a little bit of a setup for when this psalm was actually intended to, or maybe when it was written, why it was written.
O Lord, my foes are so many, many are those who attack me. Many say of me, there is no deliverance for him through God. Selah.
Okay, wait, pause right there because I want to make sure that we hit this because this is the first time we've seen this. That's honestly the best way to describe the word Selah. We're going to see it a lot in Psalms. It's made its way into even modern versions of Psalms and Christian music. Not so much Jewish music, thinking about it now, but Selah meant something when our ancestors sang it, like Amen, like when we sing Amen at the end of a verse. We're not exactly sure how it was incorporated, but we believe that when someone said, or when somebody sang Selah, that it did something, they did something as they did it. They either did it as a long flourish, maybe, or they went down, or they went up, or they did something as they were singing it, and that this was an indication in the song that this is the time to do that. Was it a big clash of the cymbals? Maybe. We don't know. And that's why the most accurate thing to say is uncertain. But we do know, and we can see that it had something to do with what people were supposed to do when they got to that, when that was there. So, yeah, it's not used too much like some of the other things that we're going to get to, which most importantly, hallelujah. But hallelujah does seem to have had it to be incorporated in the lyric and not just like this does, which comes at the end of a verse or comes at the end of a set of verses. How do we know that? Because we have Psalms that begin with the line hallelujah. So it's not just something to do, which of course it means praise God. Hallel means to praise God, to sing to God. But even though like hallelujah definitely, especially when we think about it today, has like some kind of like, it is used as a way of punctuating the music. it also is incorporated into the lyric. It's used into it's part of the poem. It's part of the composition. Selah, we're not even sure whether somebody said Selah. I'm serious. We don't know. So that's why the best thing to do is to say, we're not 100% sure what Selah means. But it was part of the music. So I do want to point that out. And you will see it. We'll see it as we go through.
But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, he who holds my head high. I cry aloud to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. Selah. I lie down and sleep and wake again, for the Lord sustains me. I have no fear of the myriad forces arrayed against me on every side. Rise, O Lord, deliver me, O my God, for you slap all my enemies in the face. You break the teeth of the wicked. Deliverance is the Lord's. Your blessing be upon your people. Selah.
Yep. And so there's one at the end, but there were other ones that were not at the end. So it can't be just amen at the end. It has to be something that people would do during the midst of the psalm more than once in some cases. So again, that's about 9 verses. They're roughly the same length. It definitely has some of a political stance about, enemies and things like that. Got a lot of enemies, right? Myriad of forces, right? A lot of people against me. Well, traditionally we said that David wrote this when he was in particular troubles, which is when he was chased out of Jerusalem by his son Absalom, who led a revolt against him, right? It's one of the most powerful stories. We read about it in the book of Samuel, that this very successful revolt that his son Absalom, who was very popular in his own right, when he drove his father out, it appeared at one point that David was doomed, that David was done. And if David didn't have very clever people working for him on the inside that stayed behind, he probably would have been wiped out. His forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and he would have died in exile, or he would have died, in his flight. But fortunately, David had a counselor he left behind who told Absalom again he needed to wait, get his forces together, and gave David time to get out and get his forces reconnected. But if Absalom had followed the words of his very, very capable but unfortunately doomed counselor Ahitophel, if he had listened to Ahitophel, he would have been victorious. And the Bible tells us that Ahitophel was right. He was always right. But Absalom didn't listen to him, and Ahitophel went off and hung himself because he realized that he wasn't being listened to. And he kind of probably also realized that Absalom was doomed if he didn't listen to him. So, Absalom eventually gets captured and killed by Joab, David's cousin. Even though David told Joab not to kill him, Joab disregarded his cousin's advice, and not advice, but orders, actually. And he killed Absalom. And David was very upset, and Joab told him to shut up. This guy just almost killed you. And it was a very powerful scene in the Bible. One of the most powerful scenes, if not the most powerful scene in the Bible. And so according to tradition, and again, we don't know for sure, but a long time ago, people said that this came out of David's mouth. And one of the reasons why is it fits that kind of situation. Of course, it fits anybody's situation who feels that they're being attacked all over the place. It's spoken, right, in the first person, right? Me, my foes are many. The people attacking me. Gosh, I wonder, is this a psalm for Donald Trump right now? I don't know. No, this is a
I haven't heard that Donald Trump spends a lot of time crying out to the Lord.
I know. You didn't have to say that. You didn't have to spill that secret. But no, what's interesting about this is that when you look at the face of this, again, this is somebody who doesn't know how to survive. It doesn't think, again, that there's any way to survive except through God, right? That's what he says. Literally, I can't survive if God isn't with me. And so fortunately, God is his shield, is his protection. Again, right? That's the shield. You're my shield, right? You help me. And what's, of course, powerful about this is that it does seem like a lot of the Psalms, and especially the Psalms we have of David, which are, my life is tough. Like Psalm 23 is like, I'm walking in the valley of the shadow of death. I mean, that's not a good place to be, but yet God is with him. And so he feels the person who wrote this, whether it's King David or somebody else, is that, yeah, life is not good right now, but it's going to be okay because God is with me. So even though people are attacking him, even though the world is not going his way right now, he's going to be okay because God is with him. And God's going to keep him safe. And again, to use some of the words that we already said, lying down, walking, standing, and here's the verb that we also talked about. One of the important ones is lying down. I lie down, and God sustains me. God is. Well, what's your translation have, by the way, for that? God sustains me. Lori, what does your translation say?
Which verse?
Or 6.
Okay, I think mine might be different than yours. I think 5. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me.
Yeah. So you lie down and sleep, and then what does it say?
I wake again because the Lord sustains me.
It's the same. They have the same word. Yes, I have a feeling that King James probably had a different translation, but it doesn't matter. I mean, the point is that the idea here, it's lying down, waking up, being wherever I am. God is kind of putting his hands on me and like helping me get up. That's the way that, I would kind of, I mean, it's powerful because again, it is this idea that God is with him wherever he is, when he's lying down, when he's rising up, when he's, in the places and in the places that we walk, we sleep, all of those kinds of situations, God is there to protect us, and God's with us in those different places that we're at. So it's really, it's really powerful. So anybody else have any questions or comments, or this is again Kuma, God, rise. Yeah. Yep. All right. So let's read another one. And what's interesting about this one, we saw Mizmor LeDavid, we saw a Psalm of David, 2 of them actually. Now we had a Psalm, even the last Psalm, Psalm 3, which was a Psalm for a certain experience that David went through, which of course is something we can all relate to. All of us can relate to those things. Now we're going to have a musical direction in addition to the Mizmor LeDavid. We also have a direction, which again is for the leader. And this word, nigionot, they translate it as instrumental music. What does your translation, Glory, say for nigionot?
For the director of music with stringed instruments, a Psalm of David.
Which is more specific than instrument, but it's understood that, again, the word lam natseach is for the leader, for the director, if you will, the person who's directing the choir, or for the conductor, maybe for the conductor. The word nigiono, we understand it to be some kind of instrumental music, maybe again, specifically string instrument. But of course, that word is what now in Hebrew? A nigun. We still use that phrase today, right? It's more in the Yiddish style of when we say a nigun, a nigun is the original Hebrew. The nigun we consider today is a song without words, right? Now, because Jews moved away from using instruments in synagogue worship, once the temple was destroyed, this was the weird thing. We interpreted the word, or we recontextualized the word. I wouldn't say we interpreted. I think we knew what it meant. That we knew that there was an instrument playing that at some point. But what we did by not having instruments is that we put the emphasis back on the vocal, but vocalizing it without saying words. So it was humming, it was singing, but not with words. The lie, lie, la, 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 lie, 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 la, 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 lie. Those are niguns. Well, that's a more modern nigun, but it's used all the time in Hasidic music, where people will start doing a nigun before they ever sing, before they ever say a word, before they ever engage in a prayer. They'll go into a nigun. It's used in Hasidic worship. People see it if they go to Chabad today, but obviously when there were a lot more Hasidic movements than just Chabad, there were some movements that really were well known for their nigunim, for their music, for their melodies. A lot of those Hasidic movements were wiped out during the Holocaust, and so we don't have their nigunim anymore. Some of them were survived with other Hasidic groups that kept those nigunim because they loved them, and they crossed different Hasidic groups. Because remember, each one of these dynasties, each one of these groups had their own special traditions, their own special songs. Some of them were completely wiped out, but some of the nigunim have made it. Of course, we have more modern versions of them. People continue to write niguns. Rick and Addie have written niguns before. Again, they're supposed to get us into a certain frame of mind. They're supposed to relax us. They're supposed to help us say the words, right? So before we can say the words, we have to almost kind of like open up our hearts. We have to be in the frame of mind that we can start saying the words, because first, like, the music is going to help transport us, help calm us, help get us into a state where the words will not just be words for us anymore. They'll be piercing our heart. We'll be able to think about them. We'll be able to, experience them. And they won't just be rote words that we just are saying out of a book. So some of the words, again, like, what do we do with them? Especially if we don't even understand the words, if we're saying them in Hebrew. But the nigun opens us up, because to some extent, the nigun puts us in the frame of mind where we are, even if we don't know what the words say, the music makes us understand like where our frame of mind is supposed to be, because the music sets that tone. So we stop doing music. We stop doing the actual, we stop doing the instrument part. Now we brought it back, but we didn't. Yeah.
The notes.
Mm-hmm.
Probably a liturgical notation indicating whether either that the psalm was to be added to the collection of works to be used by the director of music in Israel's worship services, or that when the psalm was used in the temple worship, it was to be spoken by the leader of the Levitical choir or by the choir itself. In this liturgical activity, the Levites functioned as representatives of the worshiping congregation. Following their lead, the people probably responded with Amen and praise the Lord.
Yeah, it's possibility. Those are all possibilities. And again, of course, for Christians, especially certain Christian denominations, that's what they do. Yeah, the idea that there was a choral backup for this is really important, because however they were sung, and again, what the melody sounded like, we won't know for sure. The fact that some of them, or almost all of them also, or maybe all of them at one point, had instrumental behind it. Just because it says here instrumental doesn't mean that the other ones weren't instrumental. I want to make that clear. There's not. We don't know, because there's different instrumental directions. There's not one instrumental direction. And so who's to say that the other ones that don't have instrumental directions also didn't have them, or that there was just an instrument that you could use, and it wasn't like this one was specifically, let's use this instrument or this collection of instruments. Like, let's do this to strings. There's certain things that, like, we say, okay, well, that's a string concerto. That's going to be strings. This is woodwind. Like, that's what you do with it. So, like, we don't know for sure, but that's what we think. The fact is that, like, they probably all had instrumental sounds behind them, but were there some that were like more instrumental? We don't know. But the weird thing is that for us, the instrument became the human voice. And so for us, I don't want to say it like beatboxing, because it's not beatbox, but it's a similar idea, which is that the sounds come out of our mouths. Like, when people started really doing this a cappella stuff where they were doing, kind of sounds, and they weren't using any instruments at all. That's kind of what we did for a long time, because we didn't want to play. Well, we're going to get to it, I promise. We'll get to the reasons why. And actually, one of them is in the Psalms itself. In Psalm 137, where it says we lay down our harps, the tradition to some extent was that's when the Levites got out of the music business. And they did it because they wouldn't play. Actually, the midrash on that is even more significant, which we talked about before, which is they literally cut off their thumbs so they couldn't play. But I don't want to get into that now. I already went too far by telling you that, but which means that again, there was already like arguments over whether in the second temple period they would have had the same level of music that they did in the first temple. But again, those are, because remember, those people that wept by Zion and cut off their thumbs so they couldn't play anymore, we don't know that for sure, by the way. That's the midrash on that. But the people who said we don't play that music anymore, we don't know that they ever came back to play that music in the same way in the second temple. Whether they thought they could or they should, I don't know. But again, for most of the last 2,000 years, Jews did not play music when they were in synagogue. So let's take a look at this psalm, and then we're going to hear a psalm to finish.
For the leader with instrumental music, a psalm of David. Answer me when I call, O God, my vindicator. You freed me from distress. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. You men, how long will my glory be mocked? Will you love illusions? Have recourse to frauds? Selah. Know that the Lord singles out the faithful for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. So tremble and sin no more. Ponder it on your bed and sigh. Offer sacrifices in righteousness and trust in the Lord. Many say, oh, for good days, bestow your favor on us, O Lord. You put joy into my heart when their grain and wine show increase. Safe and sound, I lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, keep me secure.
So again, another pretty short psalm, but one that also puts together some of the things you've already seen, right? Lying down, sleeping, references to motion and to, where we are when we say it. Also, of course, this idea of rain and wine, right? About things from the natural world, food, talking about those kinds of things. But again, one of the things that we see in virtually every psalm is God's protection. So a lot of the psalms, and again, that's why kind of the description of the psalm said that these are poems of despair. A lot of the psalms, and people are surprised by this, how many of the psalms are, it's really bad out there. Can you help me, God? Or you're going to help me, God. I know you're going to help me, which is interesting because it tells us that, again, things haven't changed a whole lot for us over thousands and thousands of years. The same things that people feel today, they're being mocked, that they're being, there's bad people out there who are making life tough for us. And the idea that it's going to be okay, is something that, people have been inspired by for thousands of years. what I want you to hear today, and again, however, and we're going to hear the one we're going to hear today, the psalm we're going to hear today is actually a Jewish version of it. It's not all the psalms we're going to hear are Jewish versions. Actually, like, I don't know if it's half and half, but a lot of them are written for Christian worship, or were sung by Christian artists. People around the world have been inspired by these words because they speak to us as people. They speak to us as people who oftentimes are suffering and who are going through really, really hard times. And so it's stunning for some people when they read Psalms to hear this message over and over again. Like, it's tough. And, it tells us that that's the kind of human existence, but not to give up, not to lose faith, and not to ever think that this is the way it always has to be, and that eventually, again, we're going to get out of it. And that, we're not alone. That's why, again, Psalm 23, which we'll get to, and then you'll see it's really not that much different from a lot of the other Psalms. It's beautiful. Get me wrong. There's a reason why everyone in the world sings Psalm 23, but it's very similar to a lot of the other things that we see. Lying down in green pastures, right? Safe and sound, I lie down and sleep. So you'll see these motifs throughout, and again, a lot of it is that God will be my ultimate protector. So let's take a listen to a psalm, and we're going to go back to Psalm 1. We're going to hear the psalm that we heard at the beginning, and this psalm that I picked out for today. Oh, and by the way, I didn't get into the 7 psalms of Paul Simon. Paul Simon just wrote a piece just last year, or just published it last year, which are something called 7 psalms. Maybe we'll talk about it when we get to some of the psalms that were similar to that. Paul Simon is not a religious Jew by any stretch of the imagination. He started this project because a voice, he had a dream, told him, you have to write psalms. And he said when he wrote it, he didn't even really know what a psalm was. So it wasn't like, he knew what to do. He didn't know what to do, but it came to him. And he said it was a mystical experience. So it's an interesting thing. We may hear part of it, but right now we're going to hear Psalm 1, a version of it, a Jewish version of it, actually kind of some people would say a Yemenite version of it, but this is a dance version of it. So for those who love Israeli dance, we're going to hear a version of it, Ashrei Ha'ish, and we'll listen to a little bit of psalm as we go out today. This is an Israeli dance. Look at this. This is Psalm 1. If you want to look back on Psalm 1, look back on Psalm 1.
אשרי האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת רשעים, אשרי האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת רשעים, אשרי האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת רשעים, אשרי האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת רשעים. כי בתורת השם חפצו, כי בתורת השם חפצו, ובתורתו יהגה יומם ולילה, ובתורתו יהגה יומם ולילה. אשרי האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת רשעים, אשרי האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת רשעים, אשרי האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת רשעים, אשרי האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת רשעים. כי אם בתורת השם חפצו, כי אם בתורת השם חפצו, ובתורתו יהגה יומם ולילה, ובתורתו יהגה יומם ולילה, ובתורתו יהגה יומם ולילה,
So you were able to hear it too, right? You were able to hear it and see it at the same time, right?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, good. Because I wanted to make sure that as I shared it, you also got to hear. So those were the first two verses. That's it. Like some people just take the first two verses. Some people take the first verse. Hine matov u'manayim is one verse. It's the first verse of chapter 133. But those were the first two verses. And so there's a dance that goes to that. I mean, there's dances that go to lots of Psalms, but that one's if you look up Ashrei Ha'ish, you can see people dancing to that, which is interesting because, of course, the Psalm says we're not walking with the Reshaim. We are instead we're dancing with our friends and trying to live a good life, trying to live the happy life, and singing these songs. The teaching of the Lord is delight, which is, of course, Psalms as well. So thanks everybody for being here today as we do day and night, and have a good rest of the day and the rest of the night. And again, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for reminding us, Mike, to thank you for dedicating this for your dad, for remembering the delight that you had in being with him. And so we'll see everybody next week. Next week we will be in person, and next week is also the morning of the evening of Shavuot, which we're going to be hosting at our synagogue. Tuesday night is our very special chance to be with Beth Shalom together. We're going to study this year. The focus of the study that night is actually going to be on Israel, because we're going to take a look at what our Torah tells us about our connection to Israel. We felt it was important during this time, and we're thinking about Israel regularly, to also think about how the Torah connects us to our Holy Land, which is why it says Torah Connections Israel. So that's 7 o'clock Tuesday night. So as we have a chance in the morning to study, and even in the evening that day to do two studies. But we also get blintzes and cheesecake and other good stuff too for Shavuot. So we hope to see you.
Will that be Facebooked?
Yes. Yeah, it'll be streamed, but you can't stream cheesecake. It's
Wow,
also
that's deep.
less caloric. But anyways, have a great rest of the day. I get to go back out into 100 degrees. Let me just see. What do I get to go out to right now? I know nobody's gonna cry for me, but
I'm gonna put socks on.
it's 93. All right, everybody, take care. And
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Right,
Thank
bye.
you.